I'm joined by David Wearing. He is the author of the fantastic new book, Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So what's the relationship between the present configuration of the states in the GCC, Gulf states, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, etc.? What's the relationship between how they presently are and the history of the British Empire in the region?
So, I mean, the British as an imperial power were kind of the midwife to this whole state system. So in the book I talk about, I focus on the Gulf Arab monarchies, states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is like this loose grouping of Gulf Arab monarchies. So it's Saudi, which we'll come on to, I guess, in a bit, but let's talk about perhaps first the smaller ones. Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Oman. Now, the British were in India, obviously, for, since the sort of 1700s. And the reason the British got involved in the Persian Gulf region in the late 1700s, early 1800s was to kind of create this kind of buffer region around India. So they wanted to protect India from the Russians in the north and from the French as well. So you've got the French coming into Egypt in the 1790s, Napoleon. So the British wanted to set up a buffer zone. And what they find in the Persian Gulf region is all these quite small monarchical states that didn't even really interest the Ottoman Empire of the time. So they're very much sort of peripheral to world politics at that time. And the British start cultivating these little states. They set up diplomatic relations with them, truces whereby they say, okay, we're your imperial protector and you will have no independent foreign relations with anyone but us. And over the 1800s...
And when does this start?
So this starts, I guess, 1830s. The British start taking an interest around turn of the 1700s and 1800s, and in 1830s they start setting up this system of treaties, if you like. And they draw the Qataris into that, and the Sultanate of Muscat, which turns into Oman later on. And through the sort of 1800s into the 20th century, this state system comes into being, as these countries discover oil. The British help build them up, consolidate their power. They support the monarchs, because all these countries, they're like ours, what they are now is the product of social contestation over time. But what we didn't have when Britain was turning into a democracy, but what they did have, their monarchies, was this huge external power building up the most conservative forces within those societies and propping them up and arming them and buttressing them and all the rest of it. Hence, we've got authoritarian states there today. But yeah, the British were the midwife to this whole thing, this whole process of state formation, the emergence of the state system. That's the British helping to do that.
So when you look at a map today, as it's presently set out, without the British Empire in the region, it probably would have looked very different.
It would look different, yeah. Who knows if the UAE would have existed or not. The UAE comes together just as the British are pulling out their permanent formal military presence in 1971. The British come out and the UAE is formed so that all these different states, the 7 of them, hang together in a way that consolidates their monarchical rule and helps them to sort of defend themselves from Arab nationalism and things like that. But the British oversee that process as well.
So of these nation states, the largest obviously is Saudi Arabia. It's widely known for human rights violations, one of the most, I think it's fair to say, despotic regimes in the world. The rule of law doesn't tend to apply to the royal family. Now, most Brits, or not just most Brits, most non-Arabs looking from the outwards in, would think that's purely an outgrowth of Arabian culture. They were nomads, Bedouin until a century ago. Until the 20th century, absence of modernity, absence of urbanization, literacy, etc. So invariably, that was going to happen. But that's something you disagree with quite strongly in the book, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, I don't particularly set myself up as an expert on Saudi politics and society. It's just a case of, you read the scholarly literature, all that stuff, and you can't come to any other conclusion. You look at the history of the country. This is a country like so many, which is diverse, which is plural. You've got a Shia population in the north east. You've got a fairly cosmopolitan, outward-looking population in the west of the country, where Medina and Mecca are, because obviously these are people who've been dealing with people from the rest of the world for a long time due to the pilgrimage and all the rest of it. The Saudis themselves, the Saudi royals, and their the militia that support them, they burst out of the central Arabian desert. and they conquer this diverse peninsula, as much of it as they can, and they subject these sort of, this diverse plural country to their particular brand of rule. And these various other communities that I've mentioned, this sort of rule that they're under now, at the time the Saudi kingdom's created 80, 90 years ago, this sort of thing's completely unfamiliar to them, this sort of austere Wahhabi form of Islam. It's completely unfamiliar, especially in the West, where they used to be fairly liberal, fairly cosmopolitan. And so the Saudis conquered the country. You know, Saudi Arabia is less than 100 years old. And when they conquer the country, the British are right there. The British have already got their, the state system, the trucial system that I've described in the Persian Gulf. The British are the imperial power, and they say to the House of Saud, okay, we can see that you're the ascendant power in the Arabian Peninsula. We're going to back you, we're going to give you subsidies, we're going to give you arms and all the rest of it. And the Saudi royal family consolidate their rule in the peninsula with British help. So like any other country, social contestation, those processes produce where we are today. And it just so happened that these particularly harsh forces had the backing of an outside power, and have had that ever since.
And when did the Middle East become the geopolitical crucible that it is today? Because it wasn't always so important in terms of international affairs, was it?
No, it wasn't. So I mentioned before, looking at the Middle East as a kind of buffer zone protecting the British Empire and India, which is Britain's major strategic concern for a long time. It is when oil comes in, and the reason people talk about oil with regard to the Middle East is not because of a conspiracy theory or anything else, it's just a rational reading of geopolitics. Industrial revolution, emergence of global capitalism, oil is at the heart of it. Oil is the lifeblood of the modern world economy. If you could, that's the way I describe it to my students, if I could click my fingers now, all the oil in the world disappears. We're in Mad Max territory by the end of the week. It's not just about transporting goods to market, it's about transporting anything, anywhere. It's about the production of, the things that you get out of oil, fertilizers, petrochemicals, plastics, It's such a core thing to the world economy. And a huge proportion of the world's oil reserves are there in the Middle East, so in that Gulf region. And it's not just in Saudi generally, or in Iraq generally, or in Iran generally. It's, if you look at a map, it's southern Iraq, southern Iran, northeastern Saudi. It's really in the Persian Gulf where you've got like half the world's oil reserves, 44% of the world's oil reserves. And it's that discovery in the early part of the 20th century, in Iran, and then in Iraq, and then in the Persian Gulf, in Bahrain, and then in Saudi, that really gives this area the geopolitical importance that it has now. Churchill saw it very early on. That's why he nationalised half of the Anglo-Arabia oil company, which later became BP. And British and American imperial power in the region, a lot of it was about, we've got to secure these really strategically important reserves, A, for our big corporations, for the big oil, the big 7 oil firms, and also for our strategic needs, military needs, things like that. No major power that's serious about global power can afford not to have a stake in Middle Eastern oil. And the British and the Americans knew that. They've got to control that part of the world because it's the big strategic prize. Certainly as you move into the 20th century, the mid-20th century, that becomes absolutely clear.
You talk about even actually during the Second World War, one of the major variables in terms of German failure in North Africa was an inability to access large amounts of petroleum.
I think a really good book for people to read is Daniel Jurgen's The Prize. So he's like widely regarded as the preeminent historian of oil, the political economy of oil. And the chapters in The Prize, it's a massive book, so people don't have time to read it. Just pick out the chapters on World War I and World War II, particularly World War II. So much of World War II is about oil. The reason the Japanese take out Pearl Harbor is to clear the way for them to go south and grab the oil fields in Southeast Asia. So much of the Nazis' strategy was about grabbing the oil in the Caucasus and then hopefully moving south once you've done that, while your North African corps are moving east, and in that pincer movement grabbing the oil in the Middle East. And denying them those victories was quite key to the Allies winning the war. And they knew after that, the Allies, including the erstwhile Allies, the Soviet Union, the British and the Americans, they all realised that this is a key resource. You can't fight a world war without it. You can't run a global economy without it. And whoever sits on that, or whoever's allied to the countries that sit on those reserves, they have that strategic power in the world system. There's loads of money to be made out of it, but there's also that. So it's geopolitics and commerce.
We often think the British Empire unravelled with varying speeds and varying places, but generally after the Second World War. Yeah. That isn't really the case for the countries of the Persian Gulf, is it? Could you go into some detail about how the demise of British Empire played out in these countries over the decades following 1945?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things to mention with regard to the end of the British Empire is that it didn't happen passive voice, it happened actively through people fighting for it. So people in the global south fought for their independence against the British, and the British gave up a lot of these possessions extremely reluctantly, partly through being weakened through 30 years of two world wars and a depression in the middle, but also because global south people, through their resistance, raised the costs of colonialism. And that's true in the Middle East as well. So you've got the rise of these various forms of nationalism in Iran, in Egypt most notably, but there's a general Middle Eastern nationalism, there's an Arab nationalism that's raising the cost of the British presence in the region. Now in the Gulf, the British know that that's the heart, if you like, of their interests in the Middle East, and they're really keen to back the most conservative, repressive forces possible, because they know that the populations of the region, particularly in Bahrain and Kuwait, but this is true in Saudi as well, there's a lot of nationalist feeling there, a lot of antipathy towards the British and the Americans, a lot of desire to see the oil riches spent on social development. So democracy is a threat. I think we talk a lot about the West being the agent of democracy and liberalism and all the rest of it, and the East is mired in tradition and backwardness, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the actual history of post-war British involvement in the global South is treating democracy as a threat, and people in the global South fighting for either democracy or some form of autonomy or independence. And that was absolutely the case in the Middle East. So through that period, 50s, 60s, the British are trying to hang on to their possessions in the Gulf. They're losing their possessions and their bases elsewhere, in Aden, in Iraq, their presence in Suez. But they've still got this foothold in the Gulf. And through training security forces and selling arms and all the rest of it, they're able to maintain that. And the current alliance with those states is an outgrowth of that, I think.
Is it Oman, where I think that sort of the most senior sort of economic counsel to the ruler and the head of the military was British, even after the British nominally gave the country independence?
So there's this reluctance to give up imperial possessions, but increasingly a realisation that the costs are too high. And Britain goes through the umpteenth currency crisis of the post-war era in '68. And the Labour government at the time, Harold Wilson, says, look, we can't do this anymore. We can't project power this far to the east. So we're going to pull back from east of Suez. It's the famous declaration. So the big base in Singapore goes, and the projection of power into the Gulf region goes, or at least a permanent projection of power goes. So these states are no longer British protectorates. But there are British officials through all of these governments, either acting as advisors or in some cases even ministers. Like as you say, in Oman, I think this is all set out in my book in case I misspeak, people can check in the book. But yeah, I mean, really senior people in the Omani government, lots of them were British in the 70s, the defence minister, the economic advisors and things like that. Because these people weren't seen as capable of governing themselves or couldn't be trusted to do it in a way that was consistent with British interests. So, yeah, this whole process of state formation, the British are right there guiding the whole thing, including as advisors within these governments in the post-independence era. So when British ministers now point to tyranny in the Middle East and act as though it's got nothing to do with us, it was like that when we got here, and we're just, liberal, democratic types, doing our best to conduct international relations with these sort of backwards Arabs, it's completely disingenuous. That part of the world is the way it is in no small part because of what the British did there. You know.
So you spoke briefly about Iran. Mohammed Mossadegh tried to, well, he did successfully nationalise the Anglo-Iranian oil company, now BP, in 1951. He was removed by a coup d'etat in 1953, partly involving Britain, but also the United States. Why did that happen?
So I think this is a really good way of illustrating this point that I'm making about, people in the region trying to fight for their independence, fight for democracy, fight for self-determination, and the British and the Americans being against it, So in my book and in the subsequent sort of interviews and writing, I'm really trying to stress this idea, that this dichotomy that we have between liberal West and tradition, high-bound by tradition East is false. And this is a great illustration of it. So you've got the beginnings of a parliamentary democracy in Iran, perhaps going too far to call it a full-blown democracy, but they are absolutely going in that direction. And it's a parliamentary government, legitimate Prime Minister Mossadegh, and he takes the radical step of nationalising Iran's oil so that he can spend the money on developing Iran, schools, hospitals, all that kind of stuff. This is, of course, absolutely anathema to the post-war Labour government, the idea that you should be nationalising key industries for the benefit of the population. Obviously, the Attlee government can't stand for that. We really ought not to romanticise that government, because the way they did foreign relations was appalling. They were a colonial government.
This is the Labour government after 1945?
Yeah, the one the practically sainted Attlee government. Well, they imposed a blockade on the Iranians for the crime of nationalising their own industries. And by the way, if you thought Britain was devastated by war, Iran was devastated by poverty from colonial rule and from the British extracting their wealth effectively and leaving them with pocket money, because that's how the deal worked with the Anglo-Iranian oil company. They took the profits, they sold the oil, and they gave the Iranian government a small kind of pocket money effectively. So that's why it was nationalised. The British wouldn't stand for that, so they imposed a blockade, and they tried, as you say, to rope in the CIA to topple the government or whatever. And so it becomes a CIA-led operation, CIA and MI6. Attlee government leaves, and Churchill comes in, and he's really gung-ho. The Attlee government are a bit more split about what to do. They're still hostile, split in terms of tactics. Churchill, as you would expect, very gung-ho about it. I think at one point he says to the CIA operative involved, "I wish I could have been with you. I wish I was a younger man, and I could have been with you on this great operation, crushing Iranian democracy and stealing their oil, back from them to us." So they topple the they end Iranian parliamentary democracy using, cultivating conservative forces within Iran in order to do so. And they turn the Shah from a sort of constitutional monarch into a dictator. And then you've got the Shah ruling Iran from 53 till 79. Really, really deeply authoritarian, anti-democratic regime. Amnesty described their record of torture as beyond belief. And the internal security forces, the SAVAK, they're armed and trained by the MI6 and CIA. So much for Western liberal democracy. And that, by the way, the reaction to that is what? It's the Islamic Revolution, which people will then point to and say, "Oh, look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, another example of the backward culture of people in the region." Well, it would never have happened if it hadn't been for British and American colonialism and interference. And what's interesting, another thing that's interesting about that episode is that this is part of the British and American relationship at that time is very much one of kind of frenemies in the region. So they've got their shared interest in terms of the Cold War and fighting the Soviet Union. They've got their shared interest in terms of battling Arab/Middle East nationalism, Persian nationalism. But also, at one level, the Americans want the British to kind of manage this region in the interest of the West. At another level, they kind of want to inch the British out slowly, ease them out and take over themselves. And they use the Iran episode for that. So the British don't get control of Iranian oil back. They have to settle for a split with American firms. So that's a sign that the Americans are slowly sort of shunting the British out. And that's the story people who read my book will see, through the 50s, 60s, the British just gradually losing their grip and the Americans moving in.
Sticking with Iran for a second, you actually go over the numbers on this, and for anybody watching this and they say, well, that's not exactly what David writes, it's in the book. It's towards the beginning, and you talk about the Anglo-Iranian oil company and the percentages involved. So the company, in terms of profits, would get a significant amount. The exchequer would also get, this is really important detail, I think, would get a significant amount in terms of taxes. Now this, and the Iranians get barely anything. And this does a number of things. It allows, obviously, the exchequer to have a great deal of money, helps us run budget surpluses, the Brits run budget surpluses. And because it's nominally British assets, priced in sterling, it helps with our balance of payments. So these are two things. And when people, again, talking about the Attlee government and how progressives relate to it today, they say, well, we have a 90% national debt now, but it was even bigger after the Second World War. The point is, after the Second World War, there were some quite unique variables going on in terms of how we exploited the global south to do some of the things that we did do domestically, which probably would have been impossible otherwise.
I mean, let's not say that social democracy is impossible.
No, but to maintain a standing army of that size and do the NHS would have been impossible without.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this instance, that was what happened. So we can point to other instances of social democracy in the Western world without imperialism, but the historical fact is that with British social democracy, Keynesian social democracy, post-war, it was built to a large extent on Britain's imperial relations worldwide, which continued for throughout these decades. And one of the key things I talk about in the book is the extent to which Gulf oil contributes to Britain's, or helps Britain just about manage its balance of payments problems, it's got a chronic problem with the balance of payments after World War II. It's importing oil, and the danger is if you're importing oil from dollar markets, that's really bad for your balance of payments. But it just so happens you've got this informal empire in the Middle East, and all these countries are dealing oil in sterling because that's your informal empire and those are the rules. So you're importing oil from a sterling area, so that's not bad for your balance of payments. And those companies that are doing it, as you say, are British companies, they pay their taxes to the British exchequer, all that helps as well. And also these companies sell their oil to dollar markets, so that helps with your balance of payments. I mean, the British Empire helped British social democracy happen. That's a historical fact. So if we look at that period in history, just like when people say, oh, we stood alone against Hitler, which no, us and our empire stood alone against my empire, but Britain and its empire stood against Hitler. Similarly, after World War II, there were these factors involved. Empire was a big factor in Britain's economic recovery, massively.
When people talk about Brexit, they say it's the biggest crisis for Britain since Suez, the Suez Crisis. For people watching, what was the Suez Crisis, and why did Britain get involved? Why did it make such a huge historic mistake?
So I kind of shudder because this is one of my bugbears. The Suez Crisis is known in the Middle East as the tripartite aggression because it's the French, British, Israeli aggression against Egypt. That's what it was. Secret plot, military aggression, and that's how people in the Middle East see it. And whenever we talk about the Suez Crisis, we talk about it in this really solipsistic, self-indulgent way as a terrible political crisis for us. It was an act of aggression, it's more serious than that. And again, this is we were talking about the balance of payments a moment ago and the role of Gulf oil in the balance of payments, addressing Britain's balance of payments problems post-war. So Suez is all about, to summarise it very briefly, again, it's a nationalist government trying to nationalise its key assets for its own benefit. Suez Canal, if you like, the jugular vein of the British Empire, perhaps that's a wrong anatomical analogy, but it's a really, really important link between the East and Britain, particularly for its oil imports. If it's going to import that oil from sterling markets, it wants to get it through the Suez Canal rather than, right around the south of Africa. And anyone who has control over the Suez Canal has a degree of leverage over Britain. So they're really worried about the fact that
How much of global oil supplies went through the Suez Canal in the late 50s? It's significant, isn't it?
Yeah, it's significant. I don't want to put number on it because I'll just be plucking
It's
a
in the
number
book
out my
again. It's in the
backside. But
book.
yeah, exactly. There's so many reasons for people to buy the book. It's reasonably priced as well. Yeah, no, well, look, the majority of Britain's oil came from the Gulf at that time. I think I'm remembering that pretty accurately.
That
Yeah,
is
most
correct.
of it did.
I definitely read that
yeah,
today.
Yeah, right, okay, good. Yeah, so that's a big deal. If a hostile power or a hostile country, or just not you, is controlling the flow of that oil or has the theoretical ability to stop the oil flowing, then, you know, I mean, that's how the British saw it anyway. But the reality is that, you know, for that asset, the Suez Canal, to be a worthwhile asset, you have to show that you're reliable to your customers as well. So the likelihood that NASA would have used it to hold the British to, you know, blackmail, whatever, is unlikely. But anyway, the British didn't like it. You're nationalising your own assets in your own interests and using it for, you know, your own economic development, and that's just out of bounds.
That makes you like Hitler.
Exactly, that's the rhetoric Eden was using. I mean, Eden was pretty paranoid about all this. The British ruling class was worried about it generally. Eden was extremely paranoid about losing this asset and the vulnerability of Britain in terms of that, you know, that oil route. And the French are worried about Nasser as well, because Nasser's backing the uprising in Algeria. And obviously the Israelis don't like Arab nationalism. So between them, they cook up this ridiculous plot whereby Israel and Egypt will have a war. Israel will invade Egypt. And then the British and the French will come in a completely neutral way and separate the two warring parties, and in so doing grab the Suez Canal again. And the whole thing falls apart because the Americans get wind of it. They hate the idea, not because they love NASA, but just because they think it's too crude, all this. They think it's, you're just going to wind up the Arab nationalists across the region and undermine the position of the West. So it's not like they're taking a principled position, it's a tactical position. So the Americans bring the British to heel. Britain starts going through another sterling crisis, and the Americans start selling sterling. You know, it's a real kick in the nuts for the British. Someone, I think some guy at Royal United Services Institute said on Twitter the other day, when Donald Trump said, I won't do a deal with Theresa May after Brexit, has an American president ever, you know, done something so sort of brutal to a British Prime Minister in modern history? Well, yeah, Eisenhower was absolutely savage towards Eden during the Suez Crisis. Yeah, and the British had to back off. And this is a big, this is a seminal moment in the post-war history of Britain. It's a seminal moment in the history of Britain's imperial decline, and a seminal moment in the history of the Americans easing the British out of the Middle East. But in terms of the book and in terms of my sort of discussion of Britain's relationship with the Gulf states, I'm using that to kind of, the Suez crisis, like the Iran crisis, to illustrate the fact that you've got this rise of Arab Middle East nationalism against British imperial rule, and the British are fighting this rearguard action to keep a foothold in the region. And the Gulf Arab monarchies are that foothold, and they end up being the one part of the region they can really rely on.
Sticking with the default often to cultural explanations for why people do things, often when people look at the Suez Crisis, they say, oh, it was imperial overreach by sort of, you know, a British establishment who still thought they could behave like they had done before the Second World War. But from what you identify in the book, it's far more materially motivated than that, because they wanted to maintain this positive balance of payments. They wanted to ensure circulation of this really valuable asset that helped privilege them in the global economy. So there's quite a material sort of aspect to this, which I think is really neglected in conversations around Suez. Just to hold that primacy Britain had as a sort of leading power, it almost had to act in that way, didn't it?
Yeah. So this is all about, as you say, it's Britain defending its position as a world power. And that was a lot of what the discussion was all about, because obviously it's not self-defense, this is a canal in Egypt. It's about defending Britain's status, and part of defending Britain's status was about defending the prestige of sterling. And the fear was that if we don't have this situation I just described, where we control this oil in the Middle East, we sell it in sterling, we export it to dollar markets, and that helps the balance of payments. All that props up the pound, the prestige of the pound, and that's linked to the prestige of the City of London and Britain as an investment capital and all the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, there's probably a history to be written of British policy with regard to the strength of sterling throughout the 20th century and the consistent failed attempts to prop up the pound as a symbol of, not just in pure symbolic terms, but an important economic symbol, an important manifestation of Britain's economic strength, and how they consistently got this wrong. They consistently overvalued sterling from gold standard to the ERM crisis.
Gold standard is 1930s.
Right,
1930s.
yeah, the interwar era anyway. And Suez is very much part of that. We've got to defend the strength of sterling, and we need this arrangement with regard to Middle Eastern oil, and the Suez Canal is kind of key geographical component of that. I'm not taking credit for this. This is Stephen Galpin's work, but that's a really important aspect of it. And when I get onto the modern relationship, the argument I make is that balance of payments is still a big consideration when it comes to Britain's relationship with the Gulf Arab monarchies.
Going back to Saudi Arabia, today it's got one of the best equipped air forces in the world. Historically, how dependent has the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's air force been on British support, both commercially and politically?
So the British and Americans provided this air force, and not just provided, but continue to provide, I think is the way to put it. So the big arms deal, the first big arms deal comes in the 60s. It's a Labour government again. Lightning jets that are sold in 1965. So that's the precursor of the Tornado and then the Typhoon. There's a huge deal, Tornado fighter jets. This is the biggest arms deal in the world in 1985, 87 with Thatcher. There's a new iteration of that deal in the early 90s with John Major, another fleet of Tornado military jets. And then Blair and Brown sell 72 Eurofighter Typhoons in 2007.
The 60s deal at the time was the biggest ever, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was huge.
It was the biggest ever military contract between a global North and global South player.
Yeah, and the key point to make about all these contracts is it's absolutely not a question of here are some planes, enjoy yourself those planes, see you later, nothing to do with us anymore. It's not that at all. It's here are some planes, and here's the training for your pilots so you can fly those planes. It's the components and spare parts and all that. If you need any of those, we provide them. Ammunition, we provide that. All sorts of logistical support, anything beyond the most superficial maintenance, we provide that as well. You literally can't operate your air force without our help. So it's not just a commercial deal at all. And in fact, the commercial value to the British economy as a whole of these arms sales is just grotesquely overestimated by people sort of impressionistically. They think, we make fantastic amounts of money from selling military jets to the Saudis. As a country, we don't. It's about two things. The first thing it's about is developing a relationship with these states whereby they become militarily dependent on you. Their big weapon systems can't operate without your continued help. And the Saudis have got that tie with us, and they've got that with the Americans as well, who are their major arms provider, although the British are quite significant within that. And the second thing it does, and this is really important in terms of Britain's strategic posture after World War II, Britain wants to continue being a military power. It's losing its empire. It wants to continue being a big power on the world stage. And part of that is its economic power for the City of London and all the rest of it, and part of it is its diplomatic power. Until recently, it's part as a bridge between the EU and America, and another part is its military power. Being the American lieutenant, if you like, being able to project military power worldwide. How can you afford to do that? A really expensive thing. How can you afford to have these big weapon systems, which would cost a huge amount, in fiscal terms, if you were just going to rely on tax revenue to do it? Well, the way to do it is have an export industry. So when you set up a production line for a weapon system like these military jets, which a huge amount of Britain's interventions are carried out with precisely these jets, with Tornadoes and Typhoons. Libya, Syria, going back to Iraq against ISIS recently, it's all done with these jets. When you set up the production lines for these jets, you make the jets for our Royal Air Force, for the British Royal Air Force. What do you do then? Do you mothball the production line, sack all the workers, or do you keep production going and start selling to other people? That's what makes this whole thing economically viable. So it's not a question of these British arms exports being a big commercial economic benefit to Britain as a whole, but they are of economic benefit to the British arms industry. And you need a domestic arms industry to maintain your status as a global military power. You've got to have your own arms industry. You can't be dependent on others. So that's what this is all about. Those Saudi petrodollars help to a large extent to keep Britain's domestic arms industry economically viable, and thus to help Britain maintain its status as a global military power. Like half of our military exports today go to the Gulf. Because exports to the rest of the world, arms exports to the rest of the world, have been declining in secular decline for a quarter of a century since the end of the Cold War. People stopped buying so many weapons. So it's really, really important in that respect, Gulf oil, to Britain's status as a world military power. Now, for people at home, the question is, how keen are you on Britain being a global military power? If you love the idea, if you think that's great and only good things come out of that, if that's your reading of recent history, okay, fine, we should still sell arms to the Gulf. If on the other hand that you think British military power is not such a wonderful thing and hasn't got a great record in recent years or even going back, then you realise that, we can do without this sort of thing, we can do without this business.
Maybe those tens of thousands of engineers could be put to better use with renewable energy or healthcare technologies rather than building planes for murder in Yemen.
Yeah. We've got a real security threat coming, climate change, barreling towards us at a rate of knots. It's not terrorism, a few people getting killed maybe sometimes. It's civilization ending, and it's happening. And if anyone has, I've got a few little godchildren, if you've got kids, they're going to see this stuff in their lifetimes. We've got to deal with it. We've got to deal with it in the next few years. And having British engineering skills wasted, it's worse than wasted, it's criminal what we're doing, helping the Saudis pulverise Yemen. But having all that skill used for that, when those people should surely be developing green technology, should surely be involved in the national emergency that's facing us, international emergency, of greening our economy to deal with climate change, it's obscene. So, shifting those skills, diversifying away from military industry towards green tech, I think is an absolutely urgent task. And for us as activists or people with a public voice, we've got to be urging Labour to do that. We've got to be urging politicians to do that. It's really important.
You situate the sort of present state of Gulf capitalism as dovetailing very neatly with British neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Clearly since the late 1970s.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, there's two sides of this. So let's talk about British neoliberalism first. So Britain neoliberalises out of the 70s and into the 80s, and that means liberalising the capital account of the balance of payments. It means shifting the emphasis from export industry to financial services. It doesn't mean that exports of goods just stop or shrivel up to nothing. It's still a big part of our economy, but the emphasis is shifting, right? So, and I can show you this on a graph. Britain's current account deficit it goes from current account balance to deficit, and that's neoliberalism. So all these people who say neoliberalism is not a thing, look up that graph and you'll see where neoliberalism happens. So Britain runs a large and growing current account deficit on the balance of payments because its goods exports to the rest of the world are decreasing, but it's able to square that by importing capital into its financial industry from the rest of the world. So that's how that's how the balance of payments are balancing. So you've got a big current account deficit. Where do you get all this foreign capital? If you've got a current account deficit, a big trade deficit, and you need to square that with capital coming into your country, where's this capital going to come from? Well, some of it comes from, a lot of it comes from the global north. They invest in British financial services, and then that acts as a platform back into, say, the EU, or just into British financial services. But also it comes from the Gulf, because the Gulf is absolutely awash with money. Not so much in the 80s and the 90s, but certainly in the 70s with the big oil shocks. And then in the 2000s, there's these big oil booms in the 70s, and then in the 2000s, where the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis are absolutely awash with money. Oil price goes through the roof. These are countries with pretty small populations. So once you've done everything you can for your populations, or for the parts of the population that you care about. You've got all this money left over, sovereign wealth. Send it to the British economy. So that's the dovetailing. On the one hand, you've got massive current account deficit in Britain, which needs to be squared with income from the rest of the world. On the other hand, you've got huge current account surpluses in the Gulf from the oil boom. So the two really fit together. And making that work that's not just an outcome of the mechanics of the market economy, because there's no such thing, it's all political, right? So the British state makes a huge effort to attract Gulf capital into the UK. Ministers make the effort to do that. And there's another way you can deal with this as well, with this whole current account deficit problem, trade deficit problem, is trying to find export markets to boost your exports to some degree. And it so happens that the Gulf economies are booming, and so they're hungry for imports. So the British are importing all sorts of goods and services to the Gulf. And the other reason that all this Gulf money is coming to Britain is not just because, oh, there's a place where we can invest, because they've got a financial services industry, so we can put our private wealth there in bank deposits and equities. But it's also, if we send our money to them, our historic imperial protector, our big global North ally alongside the Americans and the French, they'll stick with us. So this is sovereign wealth being invested. It's not a commercial decision, it's a political decision as well. So that's how this is all fitting together. Part of it is economics, but some of it is politics and diplomacy in a way too. When you see these big investments coming from the Emiratis and the Qataris and the British economy, the visible stuff, they're not just doing that out of pure commercial sense. They're doing it for politics too. We're broadcasting to you that we are a good economic ally as well as, as much as anything else.
A good example of this is the potential IPO of Aramco, Saudi, at present nationally owned Saudi oil company.
Yeah.
It was being touted that would be floated on the London Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
That was mothballed.
Yeah.
But if it does happen, it explains broadly what your hypothesis says about British neoliberalism and Gulf capitalism.
This would be a huge thing if it happened. I'm really hesitant about whether it's going to happen or not. So this is part of the whole Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the great reformer, who's going to transform Saudi Arabia and modernise it. So he's just like us. He's young. He knows how to use an iPhone. Blah blah blah, and he's modernising this poor backward country. The classic racist discourse. And part of what this reform agenda was all about was floating Aramco, the nationalised Saudi oil industry. Saudi oil company, floating it on some stock exchange in the world. And then all the stock exchanges like, we'll do it here, because that would be massive. That would be the biggest flotation ever. And they're only going to float a part of it. And people were talking about $1 trillion flotation. So everyone's got dollar signs in their eyes.
For context, I think Apple is the only company in the world at the moment with a market valuation of
completely
of $1 trillion.
It would be unprecedented.
Yeah.
And it's not just a question of that, it's a question of, accountants, lawyers, all these people are going to make out like bandits. So it's going to be a huge trough for people to stick their snouts into. Everyone's very excited. And there are attempts to liberalise. The problem with this is that you've got to be fairly transparent if you're going to float in the stock market, right? You've got to open your books up. The Saudis don't want to open their books because they've been running this thing like a family piggy bank, not as a serious corporation. And that's the kind of brick wall that they've hit. The British were trying to do all sorts of things like change the rules of London Stock Exchange so you don't have to be quite as transparent. And actually, loads of British capitalist interests like the Institute of Directors, senior bosses were saying, you can't undermine the credibility of our stock exchange by getting these people in and bending the rules for them. That undermines the rest of us. But the British, were so keen to win this flotation that they were prepared for a while to water down the rules on transparency. But I think it's really unlikely to happen precisely because of those rules and what it would demand from the Saudis. You've got to open up your books and show us what's really going on in this company. And I don't think they want to do that. So that's very much on the back burner now, that whole thing. But it is a good illustration of, why Gulf wealth matters to Britain. Yeah, definitely.
How central is Britain in Saudi Arabia being able to wage war in Yemen, or Bahraini regime being able to sort of crush internal dissidents? Because Brits know that we're not as big a player internationally as the United States. But from what I can gather when you write, you quite clearly think that if there was massive demand domestically in Britain for us no longer to deal with Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, that would really pose very difficult questions to those regimes, wouldn't it?
I think it would have a big effect. Yeah. And I don't still fully understand why there seems to be this impressionistic belief out there that these countries are the ones with the power and we're just doing whatever they say because we're so desperate for their money. You read articles in broadsheet newspapers and they talk about Western ministers going to Saudi and being obsequious. They're not being obsequious. The idea that Britain, fifth richest country in the world, host to the world's leading financial industry, seat on the UN Security Council, ability to project military power worldwide, the idea, nuclear power, all these things that how many other countries out of the 200 in the world can say that? Maybe 3 or 4. The idea that the Saudis are going to call the shots to a country like Britain, I think, is laughable. We're a major global north power. We're not in the US category, but as far as the second tier is concerned, we're a peer of all the others, of the French, of Germans, of Russians, and so on. So it's just nonsense on the face of it. And then you get into the specifics of it. As I said earlier, that Saudi Air Force that's pulverising Yemen right now, a large proportion of it is British jets. Those jets don't fly without British help, They run out of ammunition shortly. I mean, they ran out of ammunition actually quite early on, and that ammunition, you don't just buy ammo for a British to drop out of a British jet or fire out of a British jet from the Russians or the Chinese. It's all got to fit, the components and all the rest of it, the maintenance. Only we can provide that. So there's a big chunk of their Air Force that just doesn't operate without ongoing British assistance. And I think that's something that people need to understand. When the Saudis are pulverising Yemen, when they're bombing schools, hospitals, camps for internally displaced people, residential homes, farmland so these people can't feed themselves, when they dropped a £500 bomb on a school bus, primary school bus, a few weeks ago. They can't do that without British and American support. If the British and Americans wanted to end all this, they could pull the plug on it and it would be over.
How quickly?
Very quickly. I mean, if you can't operate your Air Force, what are you going to do? The Saudis don't have boots on the ground. They've only got their Air Force. The UAE have cultivated a few allies on the ground, but again, it's all based on aerial power largely. If you remove that, they can't fight this war. Now, that doesn't mean the Yemen war ends because it's a domestic conflict as much as anything else. But like so many domestic conflicts in the Middle East, from Lebanon in the 80s to Syria more recently, these things get escalated by outside intervention. You get regional powers piling in, backing their allies within the country, and then you get international powers backing their regional allies who are backing domestic players. And no one domestically has the incentive to make peace. It escalates the whole thing. So the key role that the British could play, if an incoming Labour government decided to, honour its promises, would be to help to de-escalate the thing. Now, the Americans are still playing a big role, more important role than the British, obviously. But I think the political pressure that would come on an American government, certainly if they'd done it when Obama was still there, but even now, that marginal increase in political pressure, look, the British have pulled out. The British have decided this carnage is too much, it's wrong, and we're going to stop participating in it. I think the political pressure that would form then on the American government would be considerable, because already Trump's under a lot of pressure from people elsewhere in Capitol Hill to bring all this to an end. So, yeah, there's a lot we can do. I think we need to recognise that war in Yemen, that carnage, 50-odd thousand people killed, 85 infant children dead of starvation, a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. We did this. The British helped to do it. We're an active participant in all this. May not be combatants in the war, but we're active participants in the conflict because the Saudis can't operate their Air Force without our help and American help. So people in the British political context, the left, politicians, journalists, need to get their head around this fact, the degree of culpability, the degree of seriousness of the situation on the ground, and how urgent it is that we start a serious international conversation about it, galvanise public pressure on the British government, and pull the plug. It won't stop the thing altogether, but it could have a really serious effect. It could save lives. You know, it's baffling to me that we obsess about things other than this. It's the biggest thing that's happening, and that Britain's doing. It's far more important than Brexit. The only thing that's less important than is climate change, and we're not taking it seriously enough. It's a big problem.